The pyramids of Egypt rise from the desert like frozen waves of stone. For thousands of years they have stood in silence, watching empires rise and fall, guarding secrets no one alive today truly remembers. We are told a simple story about them. Schoolbooks say they were built by ancient Egyptian workers using basic tools, ramps, and determination. Case closed. Mystery solved. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest man-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. It is made of more than 2 million stone blocks, many weighing as much as a large truck. Some stones fit together so tightly that even a razor blade cannot slide between them. The sides are aligned almost perfectly with true north, south, east, and west. Not roughly, not close, but with a precision that still challenges modern engineers. This alone raises a quiet but unsettling question. How did a civilization with copper tools, no wheels for heavy transport, and no written construction plans achieve something this exact? Historians often answer with confidence, but when pressed for details, the explanations become vague. Ramps are mentioned, but no clear design is agreed upon. Labor forces are suggested, but the logistics remain blurry. The deeper we dig, the more the ground seems to shift beneath our feet. Ancient writers were already puzzled by the pyramids. Even in Greek times, visitors to Egypt admitted they did not fully understand how these massive monuments were built. The builders themselves left no clear records explaining the process, no blueprints, no step-by-step instructions. Only the finished result, standing there, massive and mute. Over time, a powerful idea took hold. The pyramids were tombs built to honor god-kings and ensure their journey into the afterlife. This may be partly true, but it does not explain everything. Inside the Great Pyramid, there are no decorations, no inscriptions praising a pharaoh, no clear burial chamber with a mummy. That absence is strange, especially for a culture known for covering its tombs in text and art. Then there is the math. The pyramid's dimensions appear to encode advanced knowledge, ratios linked to the shape of the earth, measurements that echo the value of pi, alignments that match star patterns in the sky. Some scholars say this is coincidence. Others say ancient Egyptians were simply clever observers. But coincidence begins to feel less convincing when it happens again and again. This leads us to a more uncomfortable idea. What if the pyramids were not entirely the product of the civilization we credit for them? What if the ancient Egyptians inherited knowledge or structures from a time long forgotten? Mainstream history tends to shut this door quickly, warning against speculation. Yet archaeology itself shows us that human history is not a straight line. Civilizations rise, collapse, and vanish, sometimes leaving little behind. There are signs that the Giza Plateau may be older than we think. Weathering patterns on nearby monuments suggest heavy rainfall, something Egypt has not seen in thousands of years. Legends speak of a distant age, long before the pharaohs, when gods or wise beings ruled the land. These stories are usually dismissed as myth, but myths often carry fragments of memory, distorted by time. So when we ask who really built the pyramids, we are not denying Egyptian achievement. Instead, we are questioning whether the story we have been told is the whole truth or just the part that survived. And as we begin to peel back the layers, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a much larger mystery, one that reaches back into a shadowy past where history, legend, and forgotten knowledge begin to blur, and where the next clue may lie not in the stones themselves, but in what was deliberately left unsaid, waiting for us to notice as we turn our attention toward the strange inconsistencies that continue to surface when we examine the timeline more closely and begin to wonder what might have existed before the first dynasty ever carved its name into stone. To understand why these inconsistencies matter, we need to slow down and look at the timeline itself. Official history places the construction of the Great Pyramid around 4,500 years ago, during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. This date is repeated so often that it feels solid, almost unchallengeable. Yet when we ask how that date was determined, the answer is less firm than expected. There is no inscription inside the pyramid that says, "Built by Khufu," no dedication stone, no clear record describing its construction. The date is based largely on nearby artifacts and later writings, not on direct evidence from the structure itself. One of the most commonly cited pieces of evidence is a set of markings found in hidden chambers above the king's chamber. These markings include symbols believed to reference Khufu's name. But even these are debated. Some researchers have pointed out that the symbols do not match the usual formal style used for royal names. Others have raised concerns about when the markings were actually made, noting that they were discovered in the 19th century under conditions that would not meet modern archaeological standards. This does not mean the markings are fake, but it does mean they are not the unbreakable proof they are often presented as. When so much weight is placed on a small piece of evidence, it becomes important to examine it carefully rather than accept it without question. Then there is the issue of technology. Ancient Egyptian tools, as we understand them, were made mostly of copper and stone. Copper is a soft metal. It wears down quickly, especially when cutting hard stone like granite. Yet inside the Great Pyramid and other nearby structures, we find granite blocks cut and shaped with astonishing precision. Some cuts are straight and smooth in ways that are difficult to reproduce even with modern equipment. Mainstream explanations suggest years of labor, endless replacement of tools, and highly skilled craftsmanship. While this is possible, it still leaves unanswered questions. Why do we not find large numbers of worn-out tools at the sites? Why do the most precise stoneworks appear suddenly in the archaeological record without clear earlier examples showing gradual improvement? In most human technologies, we see a learning curve. Early attempts are rough, later ones improve, but with the pyramids, especially at Giza, the pattern feels reversed. The earliest structures are often the most impressive. Later pyramids are smaller, less precise, and sometimes structurally flawed. This is the opposite of what we would expect if the builders were slowly mastering new techniques. Some researchers have suggested that the Egyptians may have been repairing, modifying, or repurposing structures that were already ancient in their time. This idea is controversial, but it would explain why later generations seemed unable to match the quality of the original construction. It would also explain why the pyramids held such deep religious importance, as if they were gifts from a sacred past rather than creations of the present. Ancient texts add another layer to the mystery. Egyptian records speak of a time called Zep-Tepi, the first time when gods ruled the land and established order. These gods were said to have built temples and laid the foundations of civilization. To modern ears, this sounds like mythology, but to the ancient Egyptians, it was history, passed down through generations. If even a fragment of this memory reflects a real, very ancient culture, it would push the origins of advanced knowledge far deeper into the past than we currently accept. And that possibility makes many historians uncomfortable, because it challenges the neat timeline that places civilization as a relatively recent development. As we move beyond Egypt, similar patterns begin to appear in other parts of the world. Massive stone structures, precise engineering, myths of lost ages and forgotten builders. These connections may be coincidence, or they may hint at something more widespread. Something that once linked distant cultures before written history began. A network of knowledge that vanished so completely that only stone and story remain, inviting us to question not just who built the pyramids, but how much of our own past is still missing, hidden behind assumptions we have grown too comfortable to challenge as we prepare to follow the trail of evidence even further back into time, where the line between prehistory and history becomes harder to see and the silence of the stones grows louder. When we step back and look at those global connections, the mystery surrounding the pyramids deepens instead of fading away. Across the planet, ancient cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years all seem to share a strange obsession with massive stone construction. In Central America, towering pyramids rise from jungles. In South America, enormous stone blocks are stacked with impossible precision high in the mountains. In Asia, ancient platforms and temples align with the heavens. None of these cultures, according to standard history, were in contact with one another, and yet the similarities are hard to ignore. This does not mean they all shared the same builders, but it does suggest that advanced ideas may have existed much earlier than we are taught. Ideas about geometry, astronomy, and stoneworking appear suddenly, fully formed in multiple places. The pyramids of Egypt just happen to be the most famous example, and perhaps the most extreme. Back at Giza, the layout of the pyramids themselves raises more questions. When viewed from above, their positions appear to mirror the stars of Orion's belt. This alignment is not perfect, but it is close enough to spark serious debate. To the ancient Egyptians, Orion was associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife and rebirth. Was this alignment symbolic, or was it part of a deeper understanding of the sky? Aligning a structure to stars is not simple. It requires long-term observation and precise measurement. It also assumes that the builders cared deeply about preserving a specific moment in the sky as it appeared thousands of years ago. This suggests a level of planning that goes beyond building a tomb for a single ruler. It suggests a message, frozen in stone, meant to last far longer than one lifetime. Then there is the internal design of the Great Pyramid. Narrow shafts extend from the king's and queen's chambers, pointing toward specific stars. For years, these shafts were thought to be simple ventilation channels, but some of them do not reach the outside. Others are blocked by small stone doors with copper handles. Their purpose remains unclear. If the pyramid was only a tomb, why include features that serve no clear burial function? Why invest so much effort in hidden chambers and sealed passages? These elements feel deliberate, as if the builders wanted to conceal something, or perhaps preserve knowledge rather than a body. Some researchers believe the pyramid may have served a purpose beyond burial. Ideas range from ceremonial initiation chambers to astronomical observatories. Others suggest it may have been designed to harness natural energies, though evidence for this remains debated. What matters most is that the traditional explanation does not fully account for what we see. And still, the official narrative rarely changes. Textbooks simplify the story. Documentaries repeat familiar lines. Questions are framed as settled, even when they are not. This creates the impression that there is a consensus, when in reality, many details are still argued quietly behind the scenes. This is where the idea of a cover-up begins to emerge, not necessarily as a secret conspiracy, but as a cultural habit. Once a story becomes accepted, challenging it can threaten careers, funding, and reputations. It becomes safer to stay within established boundaries, even if those boundaries leave important questions unanswered. So the pyramids remain solid and unmoving, while the debate around them stays strangely limited. But stone does not lie, it only waits. And as new technologies allow us to scan deeper, measure more precisely, and compare evidence across continents, the cracks in the old story continue to widen, leading us closer to a realization that the true origins of the pyramids may be tied not just to Egypt, but to a forgotten chapter of human history that has been buried beneath layers of time, sand, and assumption. A chapter we are only now beginning to glimpse as we turn our focus toward the physical evidence left behind by the builders themselves and the strange choices they made that still defy simple explanation even today. To get closer to that physical evidence, we have to look not just at what was built, but how it was built. The blocks of the Great Pyramid were not all the same. Many were made from local limestone, quarried nearby, but others, especially those inside the pyramid, came from much farther away. Granite blocks were transported from Aswan, more than 500 miles south. Each of these granite blocks can weigh anywhere from 30 to 80 tons. Moving stones of that size is difficult even with modern machinery. Doing it without steel tools, cranes, or engines would require an extraordinary level of planning and coordination. Ancient Egyptians were certainly capable organizers, but the scale of this operation pushes the limits of what we know they could achieve using the methods usually described. Then there is the precision of placement. The base of the Great Pyramid is almost perfectly level, with a margin of error measured in inches across hundreds of feet. Achieving this would require advanced surveying techniques. Some researchers suggest water leveling systems were used. Others propose more complex methods involving sightlines and reference stars. But no clear consensus exists and no physical tools have been found that clearly explain how it was done. Inside the pyramid, the engineering becomes even more puzzling. The king's chamber contains massive granite beams placed above it to relieve pressure. These beams weigh dozens of tons and are stacked with careful spacing to distribute the load. This shows a deep understanding of structural stress, something that usually develops over long periods of trial and error. Yet again, we do not see earlier examples of this knowledge developing step by step. The walls inside the chambers are smooth and flat, cut with remarkable accuracy. In some places, the angles are so precise that light reflects evenly across the surface. This is not rough construction hidden behind decoration. This is intentional craftsmanship, even in areas never meant to be seen by the public. What makes this more curious is that later Egyptian structures often do not match this level of quality. Over time, pyramid construction becomes simpler, less exact, and more prone to collapse. If knowledge was increasing, we would expect improvement, not decline. The pattern suggests that something was lost rather than gained. Some archaeologists argue that the Great Pyramid represents a peak, a moment when everything came together just right. Others find that explanation unsatisfying. Peaks usually follow a climb. Here, the climb is missing. We also have to consider the workforce itself. Popular images show armies of slaves dragging stones under the whip. Modern research has corrected this image, suggesting paid workers and skilled laborers instead. Worker villages have been found, along with evidence of medical care and organized food supply. This tells us the builders were valued, not disposable. But even with tens of thousands of workers, the timeline remains tight. To place millions of blocks in roughly 20 years would require setting several blocks every minute, day and night, without interruption. This would demand near-perfect efficiency and coordination, something rarely achieved even today. At some point, the numbers stop feeling realistic. They begin to feel forced, adjusted to fit a story that must be true because it has already been accepted. And this brings us back to the core question. Are we missing a piece of the puzzle that would make all of this make sense? Perhaps the pyramids were not built entirely from scratch during one reign. Perhaps they were older structures, modified, restored, and claimed by later rulers. This was not unusual in ancient Egypt, where temples were often reused and reinscribed by successive pharaohs. If that is the case, then the pyramids may represent something far older, something inherited rather than invented. And if so, then the true builders may belong to a chapter of human history that has not survived in writing, only in stone, waiting for us to notice the clues hidden in plain sight as we continue to follow the trail deeper into the desert, toward the unanswered questions that gather around the base of the pyramids themselves, and the uncomfortable possibility that what we call ancient history may already be the aftermath of something much older. Standing at the base of the pyramids today, it is easy to feel that sense of deep time pressing in from all sides. The desert wind moves across stone that was already ancient when the first recorded pharaohs ruled Egypt. This feeling has led some researchers to look beyond written history and focus on the landscape itself for answers. The ground beneath the pyramids may be as important as the stones above it. One of the most debated topics is erosion. Certain features on the Giza Plateau, especially the nearby Sphinx enclosure, show signs of heavy water erosion. The patterns look like they were shaped by prolonged rainfall, not wind or sand. Egypt has not experienced that kind of climate for thousands of years. The last time the region saw regular heavy rain was at the end of the last ice age, more than 10,000 years ago. If these erosion patterns are correctly interpreted, they suggest that parts of the Giza complex could be far older than officially stated. This idea is highly controversial. Many geologists and archaeologists disagree, arguing that other forces could explain the weathering. But the debate itself reveals something important. The age of these monuments is not as settled as many people believe. Ancient Egyptian records also hint at a deeper past. Later pharaohs often spoke of restoring ancient structures rather than building new ones. Inscriptions describe temples that were already old, damaged by time and flood, and then repaired. This language suggests that even the Egyptians saw themselves as inheritors of a much older legacy. There are also strange gaps in the archaeological record. We see advanced stonework appear suddenly, fully developed, and then gradually decline. What we do not see is a long period of experimentation leading up to it. This absence is difficult to explain if the technology was invented locally and developed over generations. Some researchers have proposed that a highly advanced prehistoric culture existed before the end of the last ice age. According to this idea, rising sea levels and climate chaos destroyed much of their civilization, leaving only fragments behind. Coastal settlements would have been submerged, wiping out much of the physical evidence. Only inland stone monuments, like the pyramids, would have survived. This hypothesis does not claim aliens or magic. It suggests something more grounded and in some ways more unsettling. That human civilization may be far older and more complex than we currently accept, and that our timeline is incomplete. Mainstream scholars often resist this idea because it challenges the foundation of modern archaeology. If true, it would mean rewriting large parts of human history. This resistance is sometimes interpreted as a cover-up, but it may be more accurate to call it institutional caution. Changing a core narrative is slow and uncomfortable, especially when careers and reputations are built on it. Still, new tools are beginning to shift the conversation. Satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and advanced scanning technologies have revealed hidden voids and unknown structures inside the Great Pyramid. These discoveries were not predicted by traditional models. They raise new questions about design and purpose that cannot be easily brushed aside. Each new finding adds pressure to the old explanations. Not enough to break them completely, but enough to make cracks visible. And through those cracks, alternative possibilities begin to show themselves. Possibilities that suggest that the pyramids were part of a larger system, built with knowledge passed down from a forgotten age. As we move forward, the question is no longer just who built the pyramids, but when the story truly begins. Does it start with Khufu, as we are told, or does it begin much earlier, in a time erased by flood, climate change, and the slow grinding of history, leaving behind only stone giants in the sand and a trail of unanswered questions that grow louder the longer we listen and push us to examine the evidence with fresh eyes as we prepare to explore the strange role that symbolism, geometry, and hidden meaning may have played in the original design of these monuments. When we begin to explore symbolism and geometry, the pyramids seem to shift from simple monuments into something far more intentional. Geometry is not decoration here. It is structure. The Great Pyramid is not just a large pile of stone shaped like a triangle. Its proportions follow clear mathematical relationships that repeat throughout the design. The height of the pyramid compared to the length of its base forms a ratio that closely matches the value of pi. Some argue this is accidental, the result of practical building choices. But the same ratio appears again and again in different measurements. The pyramid also reflects proportions tied to the shape and size of the Earth itself. When scaled correctly, its dimensions align with the planet's radius and circumference with surprising accuracy. This raises an uncomfortable question. How could ancient builders know these values? Measuring the Earth is not simple. It requires long-distance surveying, mathematical models, and a global perspective. Official explanations suggest clever guesswork or coincidence. Yet coincidence begins to feel thin when the same patterns repeated in stone with such consistency. The orientation of the Great Pyramid adds another layer. Its sides are aligned to true north with extraordinary precision. Not magnetic north, which shifts over time, but true north based on Earth's axis. Achieving this today requires advanced instruments. In ancient times, it would require careful observation of the stars over long periods. Some researchers believe the builders used the slow movement of the sky, known as precession, to lock the pyramid into a specific moment in time. If true, the pyramid becomes not just a structure, but a marker, a kind of timestamp carved into the landscape. This idea suggests long-term thinking on a scale rarely attributed to ancient societies. Inside the pyramid, geometry continues to guide design. The angles of the passages are not random. The placement of chambers follows clear patterns. Even the so-called relieving chambers above the king's chamber are stacked in a way that seems both functional and symbolic, as if strength and meaning were equally important. Symbolism also appears in what is missing. There are no inscriptions telling us what the pyramid is for. No murals, no obvious explanation left behind. This silence feels deliberate, almost as if the builders assumed that those who needed to understand would already know, and that everyone else would simply see stone. This idea aligns with ancient traditions, where sacred knowledge was restricted, passed down orally or through symbols rather than text. Writing things down made them vulnerable. Stone geometry, on the other hand, could survive floods, fires, and the collapse of entire cultures. If the pyramids were built as knowledge vaults rather than tombs, their design choices begin to make more sense. The precision, the alignments, the hidden spaces, they feel less like decoration and more like encoding. Still, modern archaeology struggles with this interpretation because it does not fit neatly into existing categories. Structures are expected to be either practical or religious. The pyramids seem to blur that line. They are practical in their engineering, religious in their symbolism, and something else entirely in their mathematical depth. This leads us back to the idea of a cover-up, not as a grand secret meeting, but as a slow narrowing of acceptable explanations. Over time, the story became simpler because simplicity was easier to teach, easier to defend, and easier to control. Complex ideas were trimmed away, but complexity has a way of returning. Every new scan, every new measurement, every fresh comparison brings back questions that refuse to stay buried. And as those questions pile up, we are forced to consider that the pyramids may represent the endpoint of an older tradition rather than the beginning of a new one. A tradition that understood the world in ways we are only just starting to rediscover as we turn our attention to the strange similarities between Egypt and other ancient sites around the world that seem to echo the same forgotten language of stone. When those similarities are placed side by side, a quiet pattern begins to form. In Peru, massive stone walls are built with blocks so precisely shaped that they fit together without mortar. In Turkey, ancient pillars carved with symbols rise from the earth at sites far older than previously believed. In Southeast Asia, step pyramids mirror the same basic form found in Egypt, despite vast distances and no accepted contact between the cultures. Each site has its own story, its own people, and its own timeline. Yet the shared focus on stone, geometry, and alignment suggests a common way of thinking. Not the same builders traveling the world, but perhaps the same inherited ideas passed down from a much earlier source. This challenges the traditional view that early humans were mostly primitive until a sudden spark of civilization appeared in a few isolated places. Instead, it hints at a deeper foundation, a lost chapter where knowledge was already advanced, then scattered and fragmented by catastrophe. One of the strongest arguments against this idea has always been the lack of written records. If such a civilization existed, where are its texts? But this question assumes that all advanced cultures rely on writing in the same way. Writing is fragile, paper burns, clay tablets break. Entire libraries can vanish in a single fire or flood. Stone, however, endures. And if a culture expected destruction, it might choose stone and symbol over text. Messages could be encoded in proportion, alignment, and form. Knowledge would be hidden in plain sight, visible but not easily understood. The pyramids fit this idea uncomfortably well. Their design seems to reward measurement and observation rather than reading. They speak through angles, distances, and shadows. Even today, much of what we learn about them comes not from ancient words, but from modern instruments and careful study. There is also the question of why such knowledge would be hidden at all. One possibility is survival. If a civilization faced collapse, preserving information in a way that could outlast chaos would be crucial. Another possibility is control. Sacred knowledge has often been restricted, shared only with initiates, protected from misuse. In ancient Egypt, priests were guardians of complex rituals, astronomy, and mathematics. Their authority depended on exclusive access to understanding. If they inherited fragments of older knowledge, they may have preserved it without fully explaining its origin, wrapping it in myth and ritual instead. Over generations, the original meaning could fade, leaving behind tradition without context. Structures would still be built, ceremonies would still be performed, but the deeper reason why would slowly slip away. This process is not unique to Egypt. It happens in all cultures. Stories change, meanings blur. What begins as science can become religion. What begins as knowledge can become legend. So when we look at the pyramids through this lens, the question of who built them becomes layered. It may not be a single answer. It may involve multiple generations, each adding, repairing, reinterpreting, and claiming what came before. The original builders, if they existed, may be completely forgotten, their names erased by time. What remains is their work, still precise, still aligned, still refusing to fit neatly into the story we tell ourselves about the past. And as more ancient sites are uncovered and redated, the possibility grows that Egypt was not an isolated miracle, but part of a much older world network of ideas. A world that vanished so thoroughly that only its hardest creations survived, waiting for us to connect the dots and ask not just how these structures were built, but why so many cultures seem driven to leave behind the same kind of enduring stone messages that whisper of a shared origin. We are only beginning to suspect as we continue following the evidence toward the cultural and political forces that shape the modern story of the pyramids and determine which explanations were allowed to stand and which were quietly pushed aside. To understand why certain explanations were pushed aside, we have to look at how modern history itself was built. Archaeology, as a formal discipline, is relatively young. Many of its core ideas were formed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, during a time when scholars believed strongly in linear progress. The idea was simple. Humans started primitive, then slowly became advanced. Any evidence that challenged this progression was seen as a mistake rather than a clue. When the pyramids were first studied seriously, researchers approached them with assumptions already in place. Egypt was ancient, yes, but not too ancient. Advanced, but only within a narrow window. The possibility that something older existed beneath that window was rarely considered, and when it was often dismissed as fantasy. Once a framework is accepted, it becomes self-reinforcing. New discoveries are interpreted in ways that fit the existing model. Evidence that does not fit is labeled anomalous or explained away. This is not usually done out of bad intent. It is simply how human systems protect stability. Over time, this creates an invisible boundary. Questions asked inside the boundary are considered serious. Questions asked outside it are seen as fringe. The problem is that the pyramids themselves do not respect this boundary. They sit there, unchanged, forcing each generation to explain them again, often with the same unresolved gaps. There are also political and cultural pressures. Egypt is a symbol of national identity and pride. The idea that its most famous monuments might predate the known Egyptian civilization can feel threatening, as if it diminishes the achievements of the pharaohs. In reality, it could do the opposite, showing that ancient Egyptians were caretakers of an even deeper legacy. But nuance is rarely popular. Simple stories are easier to teach, easier to package, and easier to defend. The pyramids as royal tombs fit neatly into a familiar narrative of kings, power, and religion. Expanding that narrative introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty makes institutions uncomfortable. This is where the word cover-up gains power, not as a secret plot, but as a gradual narrowing of acceptable thought. Over decades, certain ideas become unthinkable, not because they are disproven, but because they challenge too much at once. Even so, the evidence keeps surfacing. Independent researchers, engineers, and geologists continue to point out details that do not fit standard explanations. Their work is often ignored or marginalized, yet it persists, slowly building a parallel conversation outside mainstream channels. What makes this especially difficult to ignore is that technology is now on their side. Modern tools can measure, scan, and model the pyramids in ways early scholars never could. Each new dataset strips away another layer of assumption and replaces it with raw information. And that information does not care about tradition. It only reflects what is actually there. Angles, distances, alignments, hidden spaces, patterns that repeat with unsettling consistency. As this quiet re-examination continues, the story of the pyramids begins to feel less like a solved case and more like an open file, one that was prematurely closed and is now being reopened piece by piece. The question shifts again, not just who built the pyramids, but why we became so certain we already knew the answer, and whether that certainty prevented us from seeing what was right in front of us all along. As we move closer to examining the strange internal features of the Great Pyramid itself, including unexplored voids and sealed passages that hint at purposes still unknown and suggest that the builders may have left behind more than we have yet uncovered. As attention turns inward into the heart of the Great Pyramid, the mystery becomes even more concentrated. For a structure supposedly explored for centuries, it continues to surprise us. Modern scanning techniques have revealed hidden voids deep within the pyramid, large empty spaces that were never documented in ancient records and were unknown to archaeologists until recently. One of these voids is massive, comparable in size to the Grand Gallery itself. Its purpose remains completely unclear. It is not accessible through known passages, and there is no obvious reason for it to exist if the pyramid was built solely as a tomb. Empty space inside a structure of this scale is not accidental. Creating it required planning, intention, and extra effort. This discovery alone reopens questions many believed were settled. If the internal layout still holds unknown features, then our understanding of the pyramid is incomplete at a fundamental level. And if we do not fully understand its internal design, how can we be certain of its original purpose? There are also small sealed doors inside narrow shafts leading away from the Queen's chamber. When robotic probes were first sent to investigate, they revealed smooth stone blocks with copper fittings. These were not crude barriers. They were carefully constructed, symmetrical, and clearly designed to be closed deliberately. What lies beyond them is still mostly unknown. Further exploration has shown additional blocking stones beyond the first, suggesting a layered system of concealment. This raises an important question. What were the builders trying to protect or preserve so carefully? In most tombs, treasures are hidden to deter grave robbers, but the Great Pyramid contains no confirmed treasures, no mummy, and no funerary objects. The effort spent sealing these shafts seems excessive if there was nothing of value behind them, unless the value was not material. Some have suggested these sealed areas were symbolic, representing pathways for the soul. Others think they may have been intended to hold objects, texts, or instruments now lost or still undiscovered. The truth is, we do not yet know, and that uncertainty is crucial. It tells us that the pyramid is not a simple structure with a single function. It is layered both physically and conceptually. Its builders thought in terms of hidden spaces, restricted access, and long-term preservation. This kind of thinking aligns more closely with safeguarding knowledge than honoring a single ruler. Knowledge can be dangerous, powerful, or misunderstood. It is often hidden, encoded, and protected, and it is often rediscovered long after its creators are gone. If the Great Pyramid was designed to endure not just physically but intellectually, then its secrets may have been intended for a future civilization capable of recognizing them. In that sense, we may be the audience the builders were waiting for. This idea is unsettling because it suggests intention across deep time, a message sent forward thousands of years, knowing that it would outlast cultures, languages, and belief systems. Stone would speak when words could not. And if that is true, then the pyramids are not relics of a dead past. They are active participants in an ongoing story, one that unfolds as our tools and perspectives evolve. Each discovery does not close the case. It opens another door. As we stand on the edge of these hidden spaces, the question becomes not just what is inside the pyramid, but what kind of minds designed it, and what they understood about time, memory, and the future that we are only beginning to grasp as we prepare to examine the human figures tied to this mystery and the strange absence of clear authorship that surrounds the greatest construction ever attempted in the ancient world. When we search for the human figures behind the pyramids, we encounter an unusual silence. Ancient Egypt celebrated its rulers loudly. Pharaohs carved their names into temples, statues, and monuments across the land. Their achievements were meant to be remembered forever. And yet the Great Pyramid, the most ambitious structure of all, carries almost no clear personal signature. Khufu's name is linked to the pyramid largely through later tradition and a handful of disputed markings. Compared to other royal monuments, this is remarkably thin. There are no statues of Khufu inside the pyramid, no inscriptions describing his divine right or his journey to the afterlife. This absence stands out, especially given how eager Egyptian rulers usually were to associate themselves with greatness. This raises the possibility that the pyramid's importance may not have been centered on a single individual at all. Instead, it may have belonged to a tradition or institution larger than any one king. Pharaohs may have acted as caretakers or participants rather than original authors. In ancient Egypt, knowledge was often divided. Priests, engineers, and astronomers held specialized roles. Much of what they knew was restricted, passed down through initiation rather than public record. If the pyramid was part of this hidden world, its true purpose may have been known only to a few. This could explain why the builders left so little written explanation. Writing things down would expose them. Oral tradition and symbolic architecture offered protection. Only those trained to read the symbols would understand what they were seeing. It also explains why later generations may have reused or reinterpreted the pyramid. Without full understanding, they would naturally project their own beliefs onto it. Over time, the original intent could fade, replaced by new stories that fit current needs. This process happens often in history. Sacred sites are reused. Meanings shift. What was once scientific becomes spiritual. What was once functional becomes ceremonial. The structure remains, but its story changes. The Great Pyramid may be a perfect example of this transformation. Built with extreme precision and intention, then slowly absorbed into a religious framework that only partially reflected its original design. If this is true, then asking who built the pyramids may be the wrong question. A better question might be who designed them and why their identity was allowed to disappear. The lack of clear authorship could be intentional. In some traditions, anonymity is a sign of higher purpose. The work matters more than the individual. The message matters more than the messenger. This idea runs against modern expectations, but it fits surprisingly well with the evidence we see. A structure that speaks through math and alignment rather than words. A monument that resists being tied to a single name. And as we consider this, we are forced to confront another uncomfortable possibility. That the builders may not have wanted to be remembered in the way we expect. That they were thinking beyond legacy, beyond power, and even beyond their own time. If so, then the pyramids are not monuments to ego. They are monuments to continuity, to survival, to something meant to outlast history itself. And that brings us to the edge of a deeper question. If knowledge was being preserved, what kind of knowledge was considered important enough to encode in stone? And what event or realization convinced the builders that such preservation was necessary in the first place? A realization that may be tied to ancient memories of catastrophe and loss that echo faintly through myths and legends across the world and lead us toward examining the role of floods, cycles of destruction, and forgotten resets in human history. Across cultures, one story repeats with strange consistency. A great flood, a collapse of the world as it was known, survivors carrying fragments of knowledge into a new age. These stories appear in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, the Americas, and beyond. They differ in detail, but the core idea remains the same. Something terrible happened, and humanity had to begin again. In Egyptian tradition, there are references to cycles of creation and destruction. The world is not seen as a straight line, but as a repeating process. Order rises, chaos returns, and order is rebuilt. This worldview fits naturally with the idea that advanced knowledge could have existed before, been lost, and then partially recovered. If a major catastrophe occurred at the end of the last ice age, as some scientific evidence suggests, it would have reshaped the planet. Melting ice sheets would raise sea levels dramatically. Coastal settlements would vanish. Weather patterns would change. Entire cultures could be erased within generations. In such a scenario, survival would matter more than legacy. Preserving knowledge would become urgent. Not just how to farm or hunt, but how the world works, how the sky moves, how time cycles, how to rebuild. Stone monuments would make sense in this context. They are not portable, but they are durable. They can anchor memory when everything else is gone, and if placed carefully, aligned with the earth and the stars, they could serve as reference points for future generations trying to understand where they are in time. The pyramids, with their precise alignments and enduring form, fit this role almost too well. They are fixed points in a changing world. They do not rely on language or culture. They rely on math and nature, things that do not change. This could explain why flood myths often include wise survivors, teachers, or gods who emerge afterward to guide humanity. These figures may represent real people who carried fragments of lost knowledge forward, reframed over time as divine. If the builders of the pyramids were heirs to such survivors, their work would not be about power or burial. It would be about warning, memory, and continuity. A message saying this has happened before, and it can happen again. This idea also explains the urgency and scale of the construction. If you believe time is limited, you build to last. You build big. You build with precision. You do not waste effort on decoration. You focus on function. And once the immediate memory of catastrophe fades, Later societies might reinterpret these structures through a religious lens. The original warning becomes myth. The original science becomes symbol. This does not require a global lost civilization ruling the world. It only requires that knowledge once existed, was scattered by disaster, and survived unevenly. Some places preserved more, some preserved less. Egypt, with its stable geography and long memory, may have been one of the places where that inheritance took root most strongly. The pyramids could be the clearest expression of that inheritance, shaped by later cultures, but grounded in something far older. As we hold this possibility in mind, the pyramids begin to feel less like isolated wonders and more like signals. Signals from a deep past, reminding us that history is not as simple or as secure as we like to believe, and that beneath the familiar story of gradual progress lies another story, one shaped by cycles, losses, and recoveries that may still be repeating even now as we move closer to the final and perhaps most difficult question of all, whether our own civilization is capable of recognizing these warnings before they are needed again. If that warning exists, it may not be obvious or dramatic. It may be subtle, woven into proportions and alignments that only reveal themselves when we look closely enough. The pyramids do not shout, they endure. And endurance itself may be the message. Modern civilization often assumes it is unique, standing at the peak of progress. We see the past as a simple ladder that led directly to us. But the pyramids challenge that comfort. They suggest that knowledge can rise, fall, and rise again. That progress is not guaranteed. That memory can be lost. One of the most unsettling aspects of this idea is how fragile our own world really is. We rely on digital storage, complex supply chains, and systems that assume stability. A major disruption could erase vast amounts of information in a very short time. Stone monuments may seem primitive, but they are immune to power failure. This may be why the pyramids still stand when so much else has vanished. They were built with an understanding of time that stretches far beyond a single lifetime or dynasty. Their builders thought in terms of thousands of years, not decades. If they wanted to preserve something essential, they chose a form that would survive almost anything. Earthquakes, floods, war, forgetfulness, even misuse. The meaning might fade, but the structure would remain, waiting. This forces us to reconsider how we define intelligence and advancement. Is it measured by speed and convenience, or by durability and foresight? The pyramids suggest the latter mattered deeply to their creators. It also forces us to question how much knowledge has already been lost. How many insights vanished with cultures that left no lasting mark? How many discoveries were made, forgotten, and then made again? We often assume that if something is not written down, it never existed. But human history is far older than writing. Oral tradition, symbol, and structure carried meaning long before ink and paper. The pyramids may be one of the last surviving expressions of that older mode of communication. Not a book, but a statement. Not an instruction manual, but a reference point. A reminder carved into the earth itself. This perspective does not diminish ancient Egyptians. It elevates them. It suggests they were part of a long chain of inheritance, preserving and adapting something precious, rather than inventing everything from scratch. And it suggests that the real cover-up, if there is one, is not about hiding a shocking truth, but about our reluctance to accept complexity. Simpler stories feel safer. Cycles of rise and fall feel unsettling. Yet the evidence continues to push us in that direction, toward a view of history that is deeper, older, and less linear than we were taught. A view where the pyramids are not anomalies, but survivors. As we approach the end of this journey, the question shifts one final time. Not who built the pyramids, but what they expected from the future. Did they believe their message would be understood, or did they simply hope it would last long enough for someone to try, someone willing to look past accepted answers and ask harder questions? Questions that may now be landing in our hands as we stand at a crossroads of our own making. Unsure whether we are listeners, students, or the next link in a repeating chain that stretches back into a forgotten past and forward into an uncertain future that may already be echoing with warnings we have yet to fully hear. At this crossroads, the pyramids stop being distant relics and start feeling uncomfortably relevant. They remind us that civilizations do not disappear because they lack intelligence. They disappear because intelligence alone is not enough. Memory, foresight, and restraint matter just as much. If earlier societies reached high levels of understanding and still fell, then progress is not a shield. It is a test, and the pyramids may stand as evidence that someone long ago realized this truth and tried to act on it. Think about the patience required to build something meant to last thousands of years. Not just physically, but conceptually. The builders had to accept that they would never see the final outcome of their work, that the people who might understand it would live in a future they could not imagine. This kind of thinking is rare. It runs against human instinct. We build for ourselves, for recognition, for legacy. The pyramids resist that impulse. They offer no clear name, no obvious story, no easy reward. They demand effort from the observer. They ask questions instead of giving answers. In that sense, the pyramids feel less like monuments and more like challenges. Challenges to each generation to rise to the level of understanding required to truly see them. This also reframes the idea of a cover-up one last time. Perhaps nothing was hidden intentionally in modern times. Perhaps the truth was simply too uncomfortable, too disruptive, and too demanding. Accepting it would mean admitting that our version of history is incomplete and that our sense of uniqueness may be an illusion. It would mean accepting that we are not standing at the end of a long climb, but somewhere in the middle of a repeating pattern. That others came before us, reached great heights, and still lost almost everything. That realization changes how we see ourselves. It changes how we see progress, and it changes how we see responsibility. If the pyramids are warnings rather than trophies, then ignoring them becomes a choice. A choice to believe that collapse only happens to others, that knowledge cannot be lost, that we are different. But stone does not care about belief. It only records intention. And the intention behind the pyramids feels deliberate, careful, and deeply aware of time's power to erase. As we look at the world today, with its rapid changes and growing uncertainties, the presence of these ancient structures feels less like coincidence and more like a reminder. That stability is temporary. That memory must be protected. That understanding must be earned. And so the pyramids remain, watching silently as they always have, waiting to see whether this civilization will ask the right questions in time or repeat the same mistakes under a different name, waiting to see whether we will recognize that the greatest achievement is not building higher, faster, or smarter, but learning how to carry knowledge safely across the fragile bridge of time that connects one age to the next, a bridge that has collapsed before and may be trembling once again as we move toward the final threads of this mystery and the unresolved tension between what we think we know and what the pyramids continue to suggest from their place in the desert, unchanged, unhurried, and still unfinished in meaning. That unresolved tension is what keeps drawing us back. Generation after generation stands before the pyramids and feels it, a sense that something important is being overlooked, that the explanation is close, but not quite within reach. The stones do not give themselves away easily. Modern science continues to circle the pyramids with increasing sophistication. Laser scans, muon detection, precise astronomical modeling. Each method adds clarity, but also adds complexity. Instead of narrowing the story, the evidence expands it. The more we learn, the harder it becomes to accept that the pyramids were built for a single simple reason. And yet, despite all this data, the official narrative changes very little. The same explanations are repeated, refined slightly, but never fundamentally questioned. This creates a strange disconnect between what is known and what is said, between discovery and interpretation. This is where the idea of a cover-up lingers, not as a dramatic secret, but as an emotional resistance. Admitting uncertainty at this scale is uncomfortable. It invites chaos into systems built on order. It suggests that experts do not have all the answers, and that history itself may be more fragile than assumed. But history has always been fragile. It survives only through what is remembered, recorded, or built to last. The pyramids outlasted everything else. That alone should tell us something. There is also the question of why the pyramids were never truly replicated. Later attempts, even within Egypt, fall short. The knowledge seems to appear fully formed, then fade. This is not how invention usually works. It looks more like inheritance followed by loss. If we accept that possibility, then the pyramids become markers of transition, not the beginning of Egyptian greatness, but a bridge between worlds, between a forgotten past and a recorded one, between myth and history. This interpretation does not require abandoning reason. It requires expanding it, allowing room for missing chapters, accepting that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when dealing with deep time. The real danger is not questioning history. The real danger is assuming it is finished. The pyramids remind us that some answers take longer than civilizations to uncover. They also remind us that meaning is not static. Each era brings new tools, new perspectives, and new questions. What could not be understood before may become clear later. What seems obvious now may someday feel naive. So the pyramids wait. They have waited through ice ages, empires, religions, and revolutions. They can wait through us as well. Whether we see them as tombs, machines, symbols, or messages may say more about us than about them. Each interpretation reflects our fears, our hopes, and our assumptions about the past and the future. And as long as those massive stones continue to stand, perfectly aligned and stubbornly silent, the question will remain open. Who really built the pyramids and what did they want us to remember? The answer may not be a name, it may not be a date, it may be a warning, a lesson, or a mirror held up to every civilization that dares to believe it has finally figured everything out. Even as the sand shifts beneath its feet, and the past quietly reminds us that there is still one final piece missing. One last turn in this story that refuses to settle and pulls us forward toward a conclusion that may never fully close, but must still be faced. That missing piece may be the hardest truth of all. The pyramids may never give us a final answer, and maybe they were never meant to. If their builders wanted certainty, they could have carved names, dates, and instructions into every wall. They did not. Instead, they left behind something far more unsettling. A structure that demands patience. A monument that resists ownership. A question made of stone. The pyramids do not explain themselves. They wait. They have waited through floods and droughts, through kings and conquerors, through belief systems that rose, hardened, and collapsed. They watched as entire civilizations convinced themselves they were permanent, only to vanish into dust. And still the pyramids remained, unchanged, asking the same quiet question to anyone willing to listen. Not who built us, but what did they understand? Perhaps the builders knew something we struggle to accept, that knowledge can be lost, that progress can reverse, that memory is fragile, and that the greatest danger is not ignorance, but certainty. By leaving behind something so precise yet so unexplained, they ensured that no single age could fully claim it. Every generation would have to face it on its own terms, measure it, argue about it, doubt itself because of it. In that way, the pyramids are not relics of a dead past. They are mirrors. They reflect back our assumptions, our confidence, our blind spots. They reveal how much we still do not know. And maybe that is the real message. That civilizations are not defined by how high they build, but by how well they remember. That stone can outlast stories. That warnings do not always come in words. As the sun rises and sets over Giza, just as it has for thousands of years, the pyramids continue to stand in silence, not as answers, but as reminders. That history is deeper than we are comfortable with, that the past is not finished with us yet, and that one day, long after we are gone, someone else may stand where we stood, looking back at the remains of our world, asking the same questions we asked of those who came before. The only difference will be whether we chose to listen while the stones were still speaking.